Surveillance cameras and other student monitoring tools are becoming more and more common in schools today. Laptops are distributed to the students and software is installed on them for their own protection, but it's important to know what is being done with the data collected outside of the classroom use, and if your students' or your own privacy is being invaded. Today's guest is Jason Kelley. Jason is the Associate Director of Digital Strategy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, focusing on how privacy and surveillance impact digital liberties. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Prey Podcast. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey Podcast today.
Thank you for the invite.
Can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background on yourself and your involvement in privacy and surveillance?
Sure. So I am a Associate Director of Digital Strategy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a digital rights organization that focuses in many different areas, but one of them is protecting privacy and fighting surveillance. As the Associate Director of Digital Strategy, I do a lot of different things. My primary message or goal is to make sure we get the message out to people. But I also focus on a couple of specific issue areas, mostly privacy and surveillance, but in particular, student privacy and the ways that surveillance has kind of crept into the school setting and into the kind of educational world.
And I'm sure we'll come back to this, but I'm sure specific to the pandemic, lots has changed in the last year and a half or 18 months, depending on when this goes live. But
spoiler, yeah, it didn't get better.
Gee, no surprise there. So let's talk about some of the kind of earlier, older privacy and surveillance stuff, and then we'll finish out with stuff that has gotten worse during the pandemic. So what do you see as some of the primary ways that privacy is being eroded for students, whether it's elementary, high school, or college? We'll kind of lump all those in together.
Yeah, the surveillance apparatus is coming at everybody from all angles. So there's a lot of different things that kids and young people, teenagers, and parents, frankly, need to be aware of around surveillance in schools. It really, a few years ago, or maybe a decade ago, I think, started being clear that big tech companies who were, for example, offering devices, there were lots of programs that places like Google had where they were offering devices to schools, and the school would then give those devices out to students. And as with many things tech, it was not 100% benevolent, unfortunately. So Google required students to make a Google account, and then they collected certain amounts of that data. And this wasn't just Google, but that's just an easy name to mention. Yeah. And there were some changes that Google made after a lot of pushback in the in somewhere around 2017, I believe. They stopped requiring data collection in the ways that they were of young people. But that was a really big focus for EFF for a while, was essentially making sure that students who were receiving these sorts of free devices through schools weren't also then required to give up private information to big tech companies. So that was a real fight in the last decade. And I wouldn't exactly say we've won that fight, but it's moved to different places. So that's in terms of device surveillance. Of course, as everyone knows, the last 20 years have been, unfortunately, one tragedy in terms of school shooting after another. And that has also caused a lot of schools to focus heavily on surveillance in kind of more traditional ways. Mm-hmm. Cameras, for example, right? When I went to school, I graduated high school in 2001. There weren't any cameras in my school. I mean, and it's hard for me to imagine that there are now, but there are. I'm sure if I went back to my school, and thankfully I haven't had to do that, there were cameras there. And it's one thing to talk about the need for, something like a camera in a hallway to ensure, let's say, safety and to be able to look back over an event that occurs there. So over the last 20 years, you get more and more of these cameras that have live feeds to the administrators throughout schools. But then technology over the last decade has made it easier and easier for police to essentially connect straight to those cameras. So 10 years ago, people might not have said, oh, yeah, let's go ahead and install cameras straight into with a feed that goes straight into the police in our schools. But once the cameras get installed and then there's an incident, then the school board passes this, new agreement with the police, and suddenly schools have a live feed, or police have a live feed into schools. So even the kind of traditional surveillance that a person might, traditional in the sense that it's not super surprising, that a person might not be, normally opposed to, has in the last few decades gotten a little bit more insidious. And there are lots of arguments a person could make about why the police should have direct access to a camera in the school. But there are certainly arguments that you could make for the reverse as well. And safety is important, but it's also a real question of what happens when cameras that only record certain things in hallways are staffed or manned by police who already have a kind of biased interpretation of things. And you go down the road and you see how this kind of just infuses our already kind of tilted justice system to a more problematic area, but now we're in schools doing it, right?
Yeah. And that's always going to be the balance to fight against surveillance and privacy and safety, and that these things they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there is definitely a tension between security and safety and privacy and surveillance. And I mean, it's good that we talk about it and that we push, that we figure out what those boundaries are, and whether it's locally decided. Probably the more local, the better.
The more local, the better. Yeah, usually, you ideally you don't want someone at the state level deciding that that all schools in the state should have cameras that feed to the police. But on the other hand, there are some pretty strong opinions at the local level to that effect as well. So that ends up happening regardless, unfortunately.
Yeah, to me, I see things like the technology as being almost more invasive, because you don't know, at least if there's a camera, there's a thought process of okay, it can only see where it can see. But when you have technology and kids are bringing it home, it's in their room, it's, what do parents do? Tell your kids, if you get a tablet or a light laptop from school, you only use it for your school stuff. Otherwise, it stays in a drawer in the kitchen where no one.
I think that's probably a good idea. Unfortunately, yeah, you mentioned the fact that cameras, have kind of a benefit and a failure point. Well, a benefit is that they don't move around, ideally.
Yeah.
Unless it's like a drone, which some schools, universities have. So the camera doesn't move around, which makes it a little bit more, easier to evade, but also just safer for privacy, right? One knows where the camera is and what it's recording. The other thing about a camera, though, is that, and this is fairly obvious, but there's all these, we've all seen a movie, and maybe this happened to us, or a TV show where a bully picks on a kid, and the kid finally he's had enough. And he runs after and chases him and punches him, and the camera might catch that, not anything else, because that's where the camera is. And unfortunately, what's happened as technology has really, as the surveillance technology that schools use has changed and shifted, those blind spots continue to exist in different ways. And unfortunately, those blind spots, because of how technology tends to work, tend to exacerbate real problems that already exist within society. So if you have facial recognition, right, that you use to enter the school, it's more likely to fail with Black and brown students.
Yeah.
So that may seem like a fairly, again, this isn't with malice. This is not intended to be nefarious. But that example just kind of is one of many, many, many examples where technology's blind spots, which once upon a time, I think most of us could understand and could imagine, like, okay, a camera can't see everything. People don't, as you say, they don't really know what those blind spots are, and they don't know the extent of the surveillance as well. So they don't know if they should put the tablet in a drawer.
Yeah.
And if the school emails and says, your kid was doing XYZ, we caught it on random app name, that we use, how does the parent interrogate the child? How does the child defend him or herself? It's definitely gotten worse over the last decade as more and more of these tools have expanded their capabilities without a real educational component for parents and children and young people about what they do.
And I suppose in some sense, when it's technology provided by a third party, the school administrators may or may not even know what the technology does. So they're thinking, hey, great, my kids who don't have computers finally have a computer. Here, use this. And they don't know that it has the capability of this other entity recording audio, video. To them, they're just ecstatic of like, oh, finally my underprivileged kid in my class now can finally get online and have access to homework and research. This is awesome. But
there's a downside.
There's the downside of that.
Yeah, and we've seen that happen. I won't be able to come up with the exact example, but one of the surveillance apps that, the student monitoring tools is probably what there's probably an even nicer euphemism for them than that. But they're often tied to the device, not tied to the user. So you get a laptop from school. It's got a program on it, let's say GoGuardian, which is one of the many tools that schools use. GoGuardian is a pretty well-known one. It's on about 18 million student laptops or devices. So you take the laptop home and you start using it for personal stuff as a student. You might not know that the teacher can, or the administrator can set up pre-recorded times to do screen captures. And they can happen for 8 hours at a time. So what they're doing is, and I'm not saying that the school necessarily is doing this with malice. This certainly isn't a widespread teachers are looking at student laptop screens at home issue. But the privacy invasions that could happen and have happened where students don't know that a teacher or administrator can look at what they're doing on their laptop, look at private information, and parents don't know either. So if you use your parent, or if you're a parent and you use your child's laptop, you probably have no idea what information is both going to a school and, as you've said, going to this third-party company that's collecting this information, supposedly de-identifying the data and aggregating it before they do anything with it. But as we know, that often leaves gaps where data can be still tied to individual users. And regardless, what's the benefit from the school's perspective of knowing what information a student is searching at 8 p.m. on the laptop, right? I mean, obviously there are instances one can think of where that can be helpful, but to subject tens of millions of students to that sort of privacy invasion every day on the off chance that someone searches how to build a bomb and they're serious, and I guarantee you most of the time they're not, That's a real question of the balance that we have to make as a society, and to, like, as you said, to choose privacy over safety or safety over privacy. And the reality is that unfortunately many of these tools, and I could talk about proctoring as an example, don't even actually do the thing they're supposed to do very well. So it's a band-aid on a problem that I'm trying to think of a good analogy for a Band-Aid that doesn't work well. It's a bad Band-Aid.
You're trying to put a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
Exactly.
It's
Yes,
really not going to
precisely.
solve the
It's
problem.
not the yeah, it's not the solution. Thank you for realizing that my problem in my analogy was the wound and not the bandage.
So it's almost like, if your child or your college or high school or any educational institution, and honestly, you could probably think about it as an employer as well. If someone else is providing you technology, it's almost best to kind of look at it from a perspective of this tech doesn't belong to me, and everything I do on this or anything I do near this has the potential to be recorded. It's almost like assume it's been compromised and it's feeding data to the bad guy.
That
Not
is
to say that it is doing that, but like that's almost like
right.
the
But
safety, the mindset you need to have around the tech.
From a threat modeling perspective, if you're a student, it's probably smart to start to try to figure out what exactly is installed. But again, it's difficult to know. The school probably has parents probably signed an agreement. That agreement probably says what the software is on the app or on the device, but it's really unclear what the capabilities are and which are turned on. They're often turned on and off at the administrative level by the school. The teacher might not even know what GoGuardian is capable of doing. As an example, there are 3 different types of GoGuardian tools: GoGuardian Admin, GoGuardian Teacher, and GoGuardian Beacon. These are all things that live more or less on a student device. And GoGuardian Admin lets administrators see certain information about student search history, screens, apps that they've used. GoGuardian Teacher does something different, but overlaps with that. GoGuardian Beacon lets the school essentially get alerted when students visit certain websites or search for certain things as an attempt at stopping mental health crises or violence. And there's a kind of well-known, I'm extremely online, so forgive me for mentioning this kind of dumb Twitter thing, but there's an image that someone that goes around the internet every 6 months of one of these apps popping up a notification to a parent or an administrator that's, just a warning that your student or your child is searching for this information that's dangerous. And the information in that warning that the child is searching for is how to teach lobsters to read. So there's a question about the accuracy of these tools as well. Like, not only are they invading privacy for students, potentially even for parents, they're also not very good at what they do. And on a similar note, the apps that block content for students block often a lot of things like LGBTQ content in the name of blocking sexually explicit material, while, because the internet is vast and ever changing, allowing through neo-Nazi content, right? You can't block it all. You can't, the best you can hope to do is stem the tide, and these tools simply can't solve every problem that society has, but they're trying to do that.
And that's, I think I've had this conversation with other guests, is we like the thought that technology can solve all of our problems, but we're social creatures. Technology is not going to solve our social issues.
Exactly.
It can help when properly used, but it's not the solution to our technology problems. If your kid is going online and looking, we'll keep it pornography. then
PG.
you know, then that's potentially a social issue, not a technology issue. It's like that's a conversation that needs to happen. Blocking that particular site at that particular moment, that particular day, doesn't address the why.
Exactly. And when it comes to the school setting, it's often even more complicated because, we have teachers that have 60 students and they're trying their best to use technology to help them do their very difficult job.
Yeah.
And, obviously parents are busy too. And much credit and kudos to parents as well. But there's a part of me that understands why a teacher would say, I can't watch every student, search for content and figure out what they're looking at.
Yeah.
I can't watch them all take a test now that we're in a pandemic. I'm going to try to use this tool that has, that everyone else I know is using in every other school. And you don't know how accurate it is, and you don't know how invasive it is. It's a understandable reach that you would use such a thing without really being able to do the deep dive into what happens when you do.
Yeah, I mean, should we expect teachers to be well-versed in everything involving programming and data gathering?
Right. No, of course
that's not their job.
Yeah.
Their job is to teach kids, not to understand the depths of how the interconnectedness of devices works.
Exactly. And I would say, to give you just an example of a thing that happened, a kind of public relations fiasco that happened a few months back in Dartmouth. And the point I want to get here is that kudos to teachers, less kudos to the companies who are selling these tools and aren't necessarily explaining what they do or aren't explaining to teachers how to use them in certain ways or not to use them in others. Mm-hmm. So in February, we at EFF have an intake desk, and so we get legal help requests. Sometimes those end up in court. Usually they don't, because usually a strongly worded letter or an activism campaign or something like that solves the problem a little bit easier. In this case, we got an intake request from a person who is a technologist. And this technologist was the partner of a woman at Dartmouth Medical School. And what the technologist sent us was basically a beacon, a help beacon, a bat signal that said all of the students at Dartmouth Medical School are having the logs of their e-learning platform called Canvas searched back a year and the university is trying to see if they can compare your remote exam taking. Let's say I took a 9 a.m. exam on a Tuesday with the logs in Canvas, which is the platform that holds course material, to see if you're accessing that material while you're taking an exam.
Were you treating it like an open book test when it was supposed to be a closed book test?
Exactly.
While remote? Okay, I got it.
While remote, precisely. And so Dartmouth didn't have a proctoring tool at that time to record students taking the exam with the webcam or what have you. So they learned that one person might have been cheating, and were told by their legal advisors that they needed to apply the same methodology to every student. And so they went back a year and looked at log data. And the log data they were looking at is in this platform called Canvas, where a student will log on with their phone, with their laptop, with their tablet, often with all three. And they won't close out the tab, they won't close out the app because there's no reason to.
Yeah, how many tabs do you have open on your browser right now?
Precisely,
16.
Yeah. One of them, if you have a Gmail tab open, you've committed the same mistake that these students did, which was they didn't close the tab. And what that meant was that it refreshed some of the course material randomly, because that's just how the app works. And it made it look like students were accessing material manually that was happening automatically. And we took a look at the data that this advocate, this technologist provided, which was one student's. I would love to call it their log, but it was what the school gave them, which was heavily. All the exculpatory evidence had been removed, and the school had essentially only left those like access patterns that seemed most nefarious on the student's part. And so we looked at this with some of the technologists at EFF and said, yeah, this isn't how logs work, that you're not understanding, like, and a reasonable person who does understand technology would look at these logs and say, well, that doesn't seem automatic, or it doesn't seem manual, because here they loaded this file, and then 7 seconds later they loaded this file, and then they answered a question at the exact same second, and then they loaded this file 10 seconds late. It just looks automatic.
Yeah.
And that's after the university had tried to remove some of the data that would have made it look even worse for them. So they singled out 20 students after looking at these logs and were on the verge of either expelling them or putting a mark on their transcript. Now, in med school, a mark on your transcript might mean that you don't get the rotation you want, right? You don't end up at the hospital you want. Your career can literally be completely derailed by a transcript change like this.
Wow.
And so we worked with an organization called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is a free speech at the university level organization, also known as FIRE. You can visit them at thefire.org. And we sent a letter to the dean of Dartmouth and said, we think you should probably rethink the way you're looking at this data. He sent us a kind of thanks but no thanks reply. And that was when we thought, okay, well, we don't know what to do. We might not, because students were definitely hiring legal counsel in this situation, but that's not really our bailiwick in that moment. And so we reached out to the Boston Globe, because Dartmouth is in that kind of news area. And the Boston Globe did a big story after interviewing students. And then a week later ended up at the New York Times on the front page of their Sunday edition. And long story short, Dartmouth rescinded all of their allegations, apologized to the students, and said they wouldn't do it again, which is great news, right? But for about 2 months, students were unsure whether or not they would be able to be doctors after getting into an Ivy League school. Who knows what they're paying to go there. And this is all because the school didn't recognize what technology can and can't do. And it's kind of an epidemic of misunderstandings of technology at the education level, because from proctoring tools that mistakenly flag head movements or coughing or a person walking across your background while you're taking an exam as cheating, to these kinds of more technically complicated but still incorrect analyses of data, it's a real misunderstanding by the administration of a lot of schools of what technology can and can't do when it comes to validating or invalidating claims of misconduct.
Mm-hmm. So what is the student supposed to do not specific to the Dartmouth student?
Sure.
But in the broader scale, like, what should students be doing when they're dealing with campus technology?
Yeah. Well, okay. So you mentioned earlier, be careful with the tech that your school gives you, right? That's, I think, super important. EFF has a resource that's attached to our surveillance self-defense website, which is at ssd.eff.org. And we've got a specific student privacy-focused guide there that gives students some tips about what to do. Things like knowing what data is being collected when you can, making sure to set social media settings correctly, And as you said, sometimes the answer is only using the school issued device when you have to. Making sure you're logged out of platforms that the school or apps that the school might have installed on your personal device. In the case of proctoring, it's a different story because those are kind of tools that you use in the moment during an exam, and you often don't have a choice to get out of them. But there are some technical measures that students can take, and then there are a few kind of social ones. If you're at a school where there's any sort of, I'll say, appetite for revolt. We've seen lots of petitions that were successful in the last year specific to proctoring and saying, we don't want these proctoring apps that record our biometrics, our personal data, and potentially give them to a third party. We don't want these to be used during tests. And they were successful. The University of California, the entire system basically said, we think that all teachers within the UC system should try to find an alternative to proctored testing, to remotely proctored testing. So you can fight back in a kind of like in a social way. And if you're a parent, which is maybe more likely to be a listener on this podcast, you can do the same thing and frankly just make sure teachers and administrators understand the dangers that these apps cause to student privacy. Because a recent report came out about 4 months ago that was basically looking at how much schools and parents understood about the technology that their students were using. And you can imagine the answers weren't good.
Yeah, very low scores.
Yeah, they're interested in learning, and so if you have the ability to kind of dig into that, I think it's a little bit incumbent on you, if you care about such a thing, to talk to the school, talk to the teacher, talk to other parents, and talk to the kids about what is and isn't happening on their devices. Yeah. So there's a lot you can do, but one of the most unfortunate things about this situation is that surveillance like this, what EFF calls disciplinary technology, it happens in places where there's a power imbalance. And sometimes even knowing doesn't solve the problem. You can learn that your boss is using productivity tracking software, and that doesn't mean you can say, I'm going to delete this. Yeah. And the same is true for a lot of privacy invasive student surveillance, whether it's on an app or in a classroom or what have you. But knowing about it is really the first step. And once you know that, I mean, I'm not advocating cheating, but I will say that if you search for just about any of these apps on Reddit and, work around, there's usually ways to figure out what they're doing and why they're bad, and even potentially how to stop them from collecting data that really often just shouldn't be collected by a third party for a school while you're in your home, right?
And all of this gets exacerbated because here we are in a pandemic, and while your kids or you might be in school today, in 2 weeks there may be an outbreak in your community. Everyone's going to be all at home again. It's in a place where there's such a flux. The chance of these products being used without people on both sides understanding what they do, how they work, is probably much higher.
That's exactly right. So EFF didn't actually have what we call a student privacy working group. We have different working groups at EFF that focus on certain issues until the pandemic started. And we started it partly because the number of students using proctoring tools went from, I'm going to make up a number, but it's relatively accurate, some numbers in the millions to some numbers in the 20, 30, 40, 50 millions. Yeah. And once that happened, it seemed like a good idea to start focusing on what kinds of surveillance were going to be forced on people because of the pandemic. And student surveillance is just one of, the many kinds of surveillance that we've implemented, some good, some bad, some much, much worse than bad, to try to make up for the problems of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And proctoring is kind of is the area where we've focused on most heavily. And just to give you a statistic that really every time I just can't believe this is real. I really started focusing on proctoring because every year there's a bar exam, several bar exams throughout the year where lawyers, people who intend to be lawyers, who graduated from law school, take the bar. It's a horrible experience. It's 2 days. It's like 6 hours.
In the best of cases, it's
exactly.
It's all these things.
Yes, it's precisely. If you're lucky, you don't have to retake it. So with the pandemic, it had to be remote, and that was true pretty much across the country. And it was true for barristers in the UK. I've talked to some of them about this, and they have their own legal action set up because all of the kind of National Bar Association people and the individual state bar associations, for the most part, said you have to take this exam through a remote proctoring tool. And in the US, that was primarily a company called ExamSoft. And to give you a sense, you're sitting at your computer, ExamSoft proctors who are either logged in or can look at the video later, can see your video. It locks down things that it makes it so you can't open other apps. It does all the things that you can kind of imagine it would do, and a few that you wouldn't expect, like determining based on your typing whether or not you're the person you say you are. It's recording patterns of your keystrokes. It's got facial recognition as well. What they call facial detection, which is to determine whether or not you're looking at the screen, which I'm one of the people that I don't think while I'm looking a person in the eye. It's harder. So if I'm taking an exam, the same thing is true. I'm looking down at the keyboard, right? Yeah, you're looking, or you're not looking at notes.
Yeah.
You're just looking out the window because you're like, what is the square root of that, And so these tools started getting used by the bar, and we wrote a letter to the Supreme Court of California, the state Supreme Court, to say, please don't require ExamSoft for the California bar because it's got problems with bias, it's inaccurate, it's a privacy invasion. Other proctoring companies have had privacy breach or data breaches, and they implemented a few measures. They made it clear that the data that was collected by ExamSoft was going to be deleted, which up until that point, there was a real problem not knowing whether the school was responsible for students asking if they want their data deleted under the CCPA, mm-hmm. versus you ask the bar versus you asked exam. So no one knew what to do. So if nothing else, the state Supreme Court said you have to delete. ExamSoft isn't going to profit from collecting this data and selling it to third parties for in this specific instance. So the bar exam happens, and ExamSoft flags, there's 9,000 test takers. ExamSoft flags 3,000 of them as cheating.
Oh, wow.
And that means that the state bar have to review the video for 3,000 tests and make sure that the student or the examinee wasn't cheating. They did that over the course of several weeks. Hundreds of students got notices saying that they had been flagged. And in the end result was something like 70 students actually received like a disciplinary action, mm-hmm. out of 3,000 that the software said were potentially cheating. ExamSoft says that's how it's supposed to work. They don't determine whether anyone cheats. They only determine whether someone does something that could be cheating, and then it's the school's responsibility or whoever to actually figure it out. And what kind of a program, what's the value in that, right?
Yeah, if 30% of, the metrics on that, like, we think a third of the people taking the test were cheating, but we don't think it was cheating. We think you just need to look at it in more detail. how do the people who are reviewing it know what is or isn't
Yeah.
cheating?
You
Well,
could
they look to the left for just a little too long. Maybe their cat was over
exactly.
there.
Right. Like, and I mean, I think luckily in this case, you know, there was a little bit of leeway. I think the state bar understood that, you know, when you have a number like that, you have to understand that, oh, this software doesn't detect cheating. It detects abnormal behavior, which could mean anything based on what the
abnormal
algorithm
is
is trained.
like 30% of the
30%.
takers exhibited
Yeah.
abnormal. So how abnormal is it really?
Yeah, great question. Yes, exactly. So we've been pushing back against proctoring, and we had a pretty big win about a month ago, which is that one of the big companies, ProctorU, there are three big proctoring companies, ExamSoft, Proctorio, and ProctorU. ProctorU is no longer allowing schools or customers to use its AI only tool. So what was happening before with this ExamSoft example is there's no reviewer on the company side, right? It's just an algorithm that says, here's 3,000 people, we think they cheated. It's just a robot that does that. And ProctorU basically said, the algorithm is wrong so much that we're not going to sell that feature unless you also pay us to review the video, because we're giving too many people false positives. Which just, again, really makes you
let's
wonder,
get rid of the feature if it doesn't work.
Yeah, like it's not a good feature. It's really kind of useless. But this is what's happened over the pandemic in many places. You know, the way that a technology that maybe it's been around for a while, maybe it's brand new, gets pushed to the front of the line as like, we hope this is going to be the solution to all of our problems. Yeah. And it takes a year or however long before people are like, yeah, you know, this doesn't actually work very well. So yeah, we've seen a lot of that over the last year, and we're hoping that, you know, that we're hoping that actually the pandemic has made it more clear to people where technology fails us, especially in the educational realm. That's our, you know, that's the best case scenario. You have to be optimistic about these things. And so that's how I sleep at night, is saying, like, you know, well, you have these giant messes and hopefully people learn from them. And this school surveillance, hopefully over the last year, has been one of those messes. There's still a lot to be determined whether or not that's the case, but that's our hope.
Yeah, well, hopefully that will make an improvement and help things to at least people to be more aware of what the issues are.
Exactly. Yes, and that's the best you can do, at least to start.
So as we wrap up here, if people want to find out more about you, EFF's mission, specifically the products or content around student privacy, we have the ssd.eff.org, the student privacy guide. Are there any other specific resources?
Those are great places to start. You can basically just go to EFF.org. You can search for student privacy there. We have a tag or what have you on our blog where all the issues that are related to student privacy, all the blog posts pop up. So that's a good place to kind of read about and stay up to date on what's going on. But SSD, the Surveillance Self-Defense Guide, is a great place to start just for anyone, whether you need assistance in figuring out what your Facebook privacy settings should be, or how to encrypt your iPhone, or what have you. Those are both really good places to start. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at and then my first initial J, my middle initial G, and then my last name Kelley, Kelley, at JG Kelley. Although, as with most, I think, people on Twitter, I only tweet about student privacy occasionally. I am more often tweeting about, you know, how annoyed I am at local politics or pictures of sandwiches and things. So apologies in advance.
And then obviously people can visit EFF and follow EFF if they're looking specifically for that type of content.
Yeah, that's probably the better choice than my Twitter is to go to Twitter and follow at EFF or go to EFF.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at EFFORG, and one day TikTok. One day.
where we need to get all of our surveillance and privacy content.
It's a perfect combination
is
of
it an oxymoron for EFF to be on TikTok?
Sometimes you have to be where the people are, and even if it seems kind of ironic, it's still the best thing. Every time we post on Facebook, someone's like, "Why are you on Facebook?" And I agree. I don't want to have to be on Facebook. I want to be on a dozen different platforms that all have different terms of service and different goals and different audiences. But right now, you have to be where the people are.
That's a perfect way to close out. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Pray podcast. If you found something in this episode actionable or noteworthy, share a comment by leaving a review at easypray.com/review. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Jason Kelley can be found at easypray.com/85.